In the early 1960s, an American Green Beret named Charlie Beckwith spent a year inside the British SAS and came home certain of one thing: America needed a unit exactly like it. For nearly 15 years, the answer was the same: it cannot be copied. The SAS is not a formula. It is a product of British history and a selection so brutal no American army would tolerate it. That doubt, that the SAS could never be built on American soil, shadowed Delta from the day it was born. This is how it was answered. Start with what Beckwith actually saw, because it explains everything that came after. In 1962, he went to the British 22 SAS on an exchange tour and ended up in the jungles of the Malayan Emergency, serving in an SAS squadron on real operations. He came back with almost no interest in their equipment or their tactics. What had changed him was their culture. The SAS he lived with was almost the opposite of the army he had left. It was small, decentralized, and mature. It trusted a sergeant to make decisions an American army would reserve for a colonel. It had no patience for ego or for rank worn like a costume. And underneath all of it sat a selection process designed not to find the strongest body in the room, but the most self-reliant mind. A man who would keep going alone, in the dark, with no one watching. What struck him hardest was how the SAS treated its own men. Rank mattered far less than judgment. A corporal who knew the ground could overrule the plan, and nobody's ego bled over it. Every operator was expected to think, to improvise, to run his own piece of the mission without waiting to be told. To an officer raised in the American Army of the early 60s, where authority flowed strictly downhill and initiative could end a career, that was close to heresy. And it worked. Beckwith watched a handful of these men do what whole battalions could not, and he understood that the difference came down to who they let in, and how much they trusted them once they were inside. He realized that this, not the gear, was the actual weapon, and that the United States had nothing like it. So he wrote it up. He came home and put a detailed report in front of the army, laying out exactly how exposed the country was, without an SAS-style unit of its own. And the army said no, not once, but for years. He resubmitted, and pushed, and was thwarted again and again, because the establishment did not want the trouble of a strange new unit that broke every rule about how the army was supposed to work. For year after year it went nowhere. He was still only a captain when he first raised it, a mid-level officer telling generals that a piece of their army needed to be rebuilt from scratch, and the generals were not interested. The Special Forces leadership felt it had enough on its plate already, without inventing a rival for its own people and its own budget. So Beckwith carried the idea for the better part of 15 years, a man convinced he had seen the future while the institution around him kept quietly filing it in a drawer. Now this is where the title of this video needs an honest word, because accuracy is the whole brand here. You will hear this framed as a single SAS officer's verdict, that the Americans would never match them. Whether one man said those exact words in an officer's mess, the record does not clearly preserve, and I am not going to put a quote in a dead man's mouth to make a cleaner story. But the belief behind that line was absolutely real, and here is the uncomfortable part. The loudest, best documented doubt did not come from the British at all. It came from Americans, from the United States Army's own leadership, who spent the better part of a decade telling Charlie Beckwith that what he wanted could not, and should not, be built. And in fairness to the doubters, they had a point. The SAS was not an idea somebody sketched on a napkin. It was the product of decades of hard, unglamorous evolution, of a specific national character, of a small professional army that had learned to trust individual initiative in a way the enormous, rank-conscious, big battalion American military simply did not. Ask that American army to suddenly grow a unit that ignored rank, decentralized authority down to sergeants, and washed out 90% of its own volunteers, and the skepticism was not stupidity. It was a reasonable bet that the host body would reject the transplant. Armies are among the most conservative institutions people build, and for good reason. They do not casually import a foreign philosophy that inverts their own chain of command. Everything about the American military of that era, its sheer scale, its reverence for rank, its habit of moving in large formations, ran against the small, quiet, self-directing model Beckwith wanted to graft on. The doubters were not just protecting turf out of stubbornness. They were defending a system that worked, against a strange idea that might not survive contact with it. If you appreciate a version of this story that respects the doubters instead of cartooning them, subscribe, because that is the level this channel works at. The doubt was rational. It just happened, in the end, to be wrong. It is also worth being honest about what Delta actually was, because the lazy version says it was simply an SAS clone, and that erases half of its blood. Yes, Beckwith modeled the selection and the structure on the SAS. But he also drew on something entirely American, his own command of Project Delta in Vietnam, where he had run unconventional reconnaissance and direct action missions under the umbrella of Mac Vo SOG, the deniable special operations world of that war. And he was not alone in the thinking. Others in special forces argued the capability could be grown in-house from hard American lessons. Above all, the Sun Tay raid, the daring 1970 attempt to rescue prisoners deep inside North Vietnam. Sun Tay hit a prison camp roughly 20 miles from Hanoi, executed with a precision that stunned the world, and its only failure was that the prisoners had been moved out before the assault force arrived. The men who studied it drew a hard lesson. America could already do this kind of surgical, high-risk, deniable operation, that the raw talent was sitting at home. So two currents ran into Delta at its birth: the British idea of how to choose and organize such men, and the American proof, written in blood in Vietnam, that its own soldiers could execute at that level. Beckwith's real insight was refusing to pick one and discard the other. Delta, when it finally came, was far more than a British unit in American uniforms. It was an American unit that had the humility to borrow the best idea the British ever had and weld it onto a fighting tradition of its own. And it aimed that idea at a threat the SAS of the 60s had not been built around: hostage rescue, the specific nightmare of the 1970s, when hijackings and kidnappings turned terrorism into a spectacle the West did not know how to stop. Delta was designed from the very outset to walk into that exact problem, which is one more reason it was never simply a copy of anything. It was the SAS idea, pointed at a newer and uglier war. The threshold finally broke in November 1977. After the terror of the early 70s made the gap impossible to ignore, Delta Force was stood up at Fort Bragg, and Beckwith got to build the thing he had been fighting for since the jungle. And the single most important decision he made was also the hardest. He refused to lower the standard. He built a selection on American soil that carried the SAS's cruelest lesson intact: the endless solo marches over brutal terrain, the hidden distances and times, the whole apparatus designed to find the self-reliant mind and reject everyone else, even when it meant failing almost everyone who tried. Plenty of people wanted him to make it easier, to fill the ranks faster. He would not. He understood that the standard was the unit, that the moment you softened it to hit a number, you had built something that only looked like the SAS, and was not. That refusal is the reason Delta became what it became. To get it right, he even brought British eyes back across the Atlantic. SAS advisors were involved as Delta built and validated its very first selection, a quiet admission that the new standard had to be measured against the real article rather than a flattering copy of it. The early courses were merciless, and the pass rates were every bit as cruel as the SAS's own. Men who were already among the finest soldiers in the army walked into those mountains and walked back out eliminated, and Beckwith let them go rather than soften a single requirement. It cost him time, and it cost him allies inside a Pentagon that wanted the unit filled and operational yesterday. He paid it anyway, because he had seen with his own eyes what the standard produced, and he would not trade it for a full roster of lesser men. Then, before it had truly proven anything, Delta walked straight into the worst night of its life. In April of 1980, the brand new unit was handed the mission it had been created for, Operation Eagle Claw, the rescue of 52 American hostages held in Tehran. It ended in catastrophe at a desert staging site called Desert One, before Delta ever reached the city. Mechanical failures crippled the helicopter force below the minimum needed to go on. The mission was aborted, and during the withdrawal a helicopter collided with a refueling aircraft on the ground and burst into flame, killing 8 American servicemen. Delta's first operation was a disaster in which it never even got to fight, and the whole world watched. If you wanted a moment that seemed to prove every doubter right, that the Americans had reached beyond their grasp, this was it. The unit that was supposed to answer the SAS had failed on its opening night, in front of everyone. The fallout was enormous. A national commission dissected exactly how it had gone wrong, and the finding was damning and clarifying at the same time. The failure was not really Delta's shooting or Delta's courage. neither of which had even been tested. It was the seams. The helicopters, the aircraft, the planners, and the operators had all come from different services that had never truly trained to fight as one machine. Out of that grim autopsy came the apparatus American Special Operations still runs on, a permanent joint command to stitch the pieces together, and a dedicated aviation unit so that Delta would never again be failed by the aircraft meant to carry it. Desert One did not just wound Delta, it forced America to rebuild its entire way of special warfare around making sure that night never repeated. Here is where the reversal actually lives, and it is not a movie ending. Delta did not answer Desert One with a single redeeming victory the next week, because that is not how it happened, and this channel does not invent the version that would feel better. What Delta did was refuse to die. The failure triggered a hard national reckoning that rebuilt American Special Operations from the ground up, and out of that wreckage came the command structure and the aviation and the joint machinery that Delta would need. And through all of it, the one thing Delta never touched was the standard. It kept selecting the same brutal way, kept the same intolerance for ego and for shortcuts, and it spent the next 2 decades quietly proving, on operation after operation the public mostly never heard about, that Beckwith had been right and the doubters had been wrong. There was never one proving headline. It was accumulation, the slow compounding of a unit that simply kept meeting its own impossible standard until the results could not be argued with. Grenada, Panama, the manhunts of the 90s, the long wars after 2001, operation by operation, most of them still unspoken to this day, Delta banked the one currency that silences doubt in this world. A record, not a single cinematic redemption, but thousands of nights of doing the hardest job on Earth to a standard that never slipped, until the idea that Americans could not build a unit to rival the SAS quietly stopped being something serious people said out loud. And the clearest single answer to the old doubt came on a battlefield where Delta fought beside the SAS as an absolute equal. In the Iraq War, a joint hunter-killer task force, known on the British side as Task Force Black, fused the very best of both nations, Delta Force and the SAS at its core, alongside the Rangers, DEV GRU, and British Special Forces. Operating shoulder to shoulder, playing by the same standard, they tore the leadership out of the insurgency. Think about what that arrangement required. For the SAS to fold Delta into its most sensitive operations, and for Delta to do the same in return, each had to regard the other as fully its equal, trusted with the lives of its men and the secrets of its missions. There is no higher verdict one elite unit can pass on another. In under 5 years, that combined force killed or captured more than 3,500 enemy in the Baghdad area, and the effect was so total that bombings in the city reportedly fell from over 150 a month to around 2. That same task force is believed to have helped run down the most wanted man in the country, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, killed in an airstrike outside Bakuba. By that point, Delta and the SAS were not comparing selection pipelines. They were sharing target packages and bleeding for each other's missions. That is the answer to whether an American unit could ever match the SAS. By then, the SAS had stopped measuring Delta against itself. It was trusting Delta at its own shoulder, on the hardest missions either country had, because the two had become the closest special operations partnership on Earth. So sit with what actually happened to that old doubt. Nobody ever proved the SAS could not be copied, because Delta never really copied it. It did something better. It took the one irreplaceable idea, the standard that finds the self-reliant mind and never bends, and it built an American unit around it that grew into the SAS's equal and its closest ally. The doubt was not answered with a win. It was answered with 50 years of never lowering the bar, until the question itself stopped making sense. So here is the argument worth having, and the comments are the place for it. Was the doubt ever really wrong, or just aimed at the wrong target? Delta never became the SAS. It became something that stands beside the SAS as an equal, built on a borrowed idea and an American spine. So tell me, is that the doubters being proven wrong? Or is it the highest possible proof that they were right about how good the SAS idea was in the first place? Make the case below, and if you want to see the standard Beckwith refused to lower, the one that still runs in those mountains today, the video on screen breaks down exactly what makes a Delta operator.